Recently, a reader asked a very good question. What would be the impact of Russia cutting off all gas supplies to Europe this winter? Well, it'd be a very serious situation because it would lead to higher prices, more inflation, lower economic growth. The IMF predicts European Union GDP could fall between 1% and 3%, which is equivalent to quite a serious recession. And given all the economic problems we have at the moment with rising interest rates, cost of living crisis, the cutting off gas supplies would be another problem to contend with. However, the worst case scenarios that many firms try to portray at the start of a crisis, that there was no substitutes of gas, may prove to be an exaggeration, because in recent months, higher prices have already encouraged firms to find alternative ways to produce goods, reduce demand, and it's surprising how adaptable firms can be faced with rising prices. And also governments have introduced new laws to try to reduce gas use and find alternatives. So although we cannot replace Russian gas this winter, the impact may not be as devastating as what once we first feared. In this video, we'll look at the implications of lower gas supplies, who will be most affected, and what, if anything, we can do about it. So I hope you stay around, watch this video, and if you like the channel, please subscribe. Now, at the start of the crisis back in February 2022, many firms said absolutely they cannot substitute gas. It's essential to industrial production, and therefore there's no way that we can contemplate losing gas supplies. But the interesting thing is that the price of gas has gone up quite significantly as Russia have reduced supply, although not cut it off. Supply has fallen by about 60%. But the interesting thing is how the market mechanism is to some extent working, in the sense that the higher prices have really acted as an incentive to cut output. So for example, Mercedes-Benz initially claimed gas was completely essential to their industrial production, but now are finding ways to cut gas by 50%. And firms can reduce their gas consumption through a variety of ways, such as reducing down the heating in offices and factories, switching to alternative fuel sources such as oil-powered fuel energy, and rather than making, say, fertilizer with natural gas, firms can import the ammonia and fertilizer directly. So it's a classic example of businesses lobbying against something they don't want to have to deal with. And it's understandable from their perspective, because reduced supply of gas is a problem. It increases their costs, it causes problems, they have to find alternatives. But it's amazing how adaptable economies can be. And when we're forced to do something through higher prices or cutting off supply, then it's amazing how resourceful we can be. And so this suggests that the cut-off of gas may not be as damaging as we first thought. And also the higher prices of gas have really forced governments to think that cutting off of gas is a real possibility. And since Russia accounts for 40% of the gas, we need to do something about it. So you see many European countries starting to preemptively deal with the crisis. So for example, Italy have introduced a new law stating that air conditioning shouldn't go below 25 degrees and the maximum temperature for heating in public buildings should be 19 degrees. And Spain's introduced something similar with a minimum temperature of air conditioning of 27 degrees. And he's trying to encourage people to go shopping in t-shirts rather than expecting air conditioning, which we don't really need. And the good thing is that to some extent there's political support for this for two reasons. Firstly, there's widespread sympathy for Ukraine after the invasion by Russia. And secondly, there's the environmental aspect, that maybe this is something we should have been doing for a long time, reducing energy use. And this crisis is kind of building up to a head, saying, it's about time we reduce unnecessary energy use. So there will be some sympathy for these actions. And I think many of us households are thinking along similar lines to the government. How can we reduce our energy needs? How can we reduce our electricity? A couple of years ago, I didn't really think about electricity use. You just use what you needed. But now a price is rising so rapidly, and in the UK they could go up to ridiculous prices in winter. From about £1,000 a year to mind-boggling figures of £5,000 a year. It definitely makes you think twice. Do I need this light on? Turn out the light, save a bit of money. But it doesn't look quite as good, does it? Anyway, there are ways to reduce demand, and the price mechanism is very good at forcing people into making hard choices. And where you may think there isn't substitutes, actually there are ways to reduce our gas use. However, having said all that, we shouldn't underestimate the potential costs of even a partial shut-off of gas, because the increase in gas prices for households and those on low incomes is really very devastating. For people already facing a cost of living crisis, with higher inflation and falling real wages, these higher energy prices will be very difficult to deal with. And for many people, they simply won't be able to pay, or they may have to cut out other essential items to pay it. So it will cause great political turmoil. And although there's some enthusiasm for reducing energy use, I think if we get a cold, hard winter and people aren't able to turn the heating on, then it really focuses mind on the immediate problem. And understandably too, because we shouldn't think lightly about these situations. It's okay if you're fit, young and healthy, and you can deal with fluctuations in temperature. But for the elderly or those who are sick, it can actually be very life-threatening to have to deal with large fluctuations in the temperature that we're not used to. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that in addition to the reduced demand, there's also been increased supplies from other areas. So America has been exporting more liquid natural gas in containers, and this is helping to fill some of the shortages from lower Russian supply. However, it's worth also thinking of the global picture, not just the impact on Europe, because what's been happening is that America has been exporting more gas to Europe because Europe is willing to pay the price. But this has meant less supplies to Asia. And global prices of gas are rising. So this impact is not just on Europe, but also global gas and energy prices, which are making it difficult for people in developing countries where there's also great sensitivity to rises in energy prices. Also, as well as reducing demand, European governments have been looking at alternative energy sources, and recently the German government, you could say reluctantly, agreed to turn back on quite a few coal-powered power generators. And for the Green government, Green ministers, they said it was a very bitter moment because, of course, coal-powered energy is one of the worst contributors to global warming. But given the immediate crisis of cutting off gas, they want to be prepared and have alternative energy uses rather than let people become very cold over winter. But it does indicate the harsh decisions and the difficult trade-offs that we have to face when gas supplies are cut off. Also, the IMF predicts that a cut-off of gas could cause significant falls in GDP. For the European Union, they forecast a figure between 1% and 3%. And that's a big fall in economic growth because, in addition, there may be knock-on effects with lower confidence from the higher gas prices and uncertainty causing falling investment and falling spending. And the interesting thing is the IMF distinguishes between two possibilities. One is maintaining an integrated market, and the other is where's each country for its own. Because if we have an integrated approach and European buying, then the supply of gas goes to those areas most in need. And so this helps to deal with acute shortages and means that we can ration it in a fair way. But if this breaks down, if the European Union unity breaks down, then the countries with most buying power, the richest countries, like for example Germany, may be able to hoard gas or get more gas at the expense of poor countries who can't. And then when you get this each man for himself, it's much more likely that you get real shortages and much more negative impact on economic growth. So hopefully the European Union, the unity there will survive because it makes it much easier to deal with a crisis like this. Also, I made another video recently about the economic impact of sanctions on Russia and suggested that the impact of sanctions was actually really quite devastating for Russia, and it's much worse than their official statistics suggest. And I do believe that because of this, the Russian government's financial position is quite perilous, and therefore in practice they don't actually want to cut off gas supplies completely because it would hurt them more than it would hurt Europe. And I think that their best kind of strategy, you could say, is to do what they're doing now, which is to cut off supply a little bit, create uncertainty, kind of threaten worse cut-offs, so that the price of gas is pushed up. So they're getting the best of both worlds, exporting some gas but at a higher price. And if they cut it off completely, I'd be quite surprised, because it would be a real move of desperation. And although it would hurt Europe, I think it would hurt Russia as well. Another element to the cutting off the gas is that we have a real inflation problem in Europe, unprecedented. I mean, the last time Germany and Europe had this kind of inflation of 8-9% was a long time ago. And in the UK, it's even more acute because we have higher underlying inflation. Energy is only about a third of the present inflation. So the UK has inflation of 9% and it's forecast to rise to at least 13% over winter because of rising gas prices. And that's assuming that the gas stays on. If the gas is cut off, then who knows what will happen to gas prices, and inflation will go even higher. And the problem is that this inflation comes at the worst possible time. The economy is slowing down, we're heading towards a recession, and the Bank of England have hinted that not even hinted, they've actually strongly suggested they're going to do everything it takes to bring inflation under control, even if it causes inflation. So interest rates are rising. And if we get more imported inflation from higher gas prices, then that means that interest rates may rise further, creating another kind of economic hardship and deeper recession. I should say that out of all the European economies, the UK is one of the worst hit. And in a future video next week, I would like to look at why the UK economy is doing much worse than everybody else. Partly Brexit, but other things as well. Anyway, that'll be an interesting video. But back to this topic. First of all, the worst case scenarios of Russia cutting off of gas isn't as bad as some people made out to be. The market is fairly adaptable at finding alternatives, finding ways to reduce energy use. However, we shouldn't underestimate the real costs of higher gas prices and the lower supply, because supply, although somewhat adaptable, is still very inelastic. It is hard to replace all the gas that comes from pipelines from Russia. And although firms can find ways around it, it does raise their costs, it does reduce their output, and it will contribute towards negative economic growth. A big question is, how cold will this winter be? If it's mild, then it'll be much easier to get by. But if it's very cold and we need more gas for heating and household and industrial use, then the impact will be greater. So to conclude, it is a real problem. And I think that it will really exacerbate the cost of living crisis for many ordinary people like me and yourself. And we will have to think of ways to reduce our energy uses if we're not doing so already. But economies are very adaptable. And although it sounds dramatic to cut off gas supplies from Russia, the economy won't collapse or anything like that. But it may precipitate a deeper recession, which would be quite damaging given all that's going on in the economy today.